I've got a major update in the DB Cooper investigation, plus information regarding CooperCon 2022. Hey friends, how you doing? Eric Ulis here. Okay, to begin with very quickly, I want to mention that CooperCon 2022 pre-sale tickets are available right now, and they're limited to 51, noting the 51st anniversary of the DB Cooper skyjacking. CooperCon this year will take place in Portland, Oregon. The dates are November 18 through 20. And for those who are interested, check out the website coopercon2022.com. All right, so let's get to the really exciting stuff here that I have for you. So you may recall that there were particles that came from DB Cooper's tie that were analyzed by a company called McCrone Labs based in Chicago. They identified something north of 100,000 particles, and these particles are unique. These are commercially pure titanium, alloyed titanium, high-grade stainless steel, high-grade aluminum, and an array of other interesting alloys as well as rare earth elements. All things that, quite frankly, are very unique today in 2022 and would be hard to, frankly, pick up on your clothing today going to work in 2022, not to mention in the 1960s, which is when DB Cooper was obviously wearing this clip-on tie. So why this is important, again, is because I noticed that there were three very unique particles, all one and the same, which was a titanium and antimony alloy. And moreover, this pointed me to a patent that a specific company received, regarding this specific titanium and antimony alloy that is of a certain chemical balance. And this company was called REM-CREW Titanium, based in Midland, Pennsylvania. They also had some offices and so forth in the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area. They were later bought out by a company called Crucible Steel, and then they were bought out by a company called Colt Enterprises. And there's been a sort of a change of hands regarding this company over the last 60 years several times. But nonetheless, why this is important is because effectively this particular alloy, this titanium antimony alloy, is what I would call basically commercial DNA. Again, just as human DNA can point to a very specific person, commercial DNA points to a specific company. And the reason why is because this titanium antimony alloy was again produced in an experimental capacity at this company, REM-CREW Titanium, and it was never sold commercially. So it's not the kind of thing you're going to pick up somewhere else. There's only one place this could have come from, and DB Cooper had three of these particles on his tie. So that seems to pretty clearly indicate that DB Cooper came from REM-CREW Titanium back in the 1950s leading into the 1960s. Okay, so I reached out to the president of the current company that owns what it used to be REM-CREW Titanium, and spoke with him about it and talked a little bit about what was found on the tie. And he was of the opinion, as am I, that the particles that were on the tie seemed to indicate that DB Cooper came, in all likelihood, from REM-CREW's research lab. Now, their research lab is located in the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area. It's not located in Midland, Pennsylvania. But very importantly, it was a very small group of people that were working in this research lab. Okay, so let's fast forward a little bit here. Now, there are a couple of people, a guy named Chris Brower, as well as Nikki Broughton, who have also been doing some research and looking into determining people who worked at REM-CREW back in the day and all this other kind of stuff. And there was a name that between the two of them, and I think Chris was probably the person who spearheaded this ultimately, there's the name of a gentleman who's still alive today, who used to work at REM-CREW back in the 50s, going into the 60s and so forth. And obviously there aren't many of these guys around anymore. So I did manage to come up with this person's contact information and did actually speak with this gentleman. He's 89 years of age, and he's only one of a couple of guys that are actually still around that worked in this research lab. But it was very important for a number of reasons, because he gave me a lot of good first-hand information related to what was taking place there, which matches up perfectly as I would expect it to match up. But also very importantly, he gave me a name. Now, I'm not going to mention the name of this individual right now because there's a lot of additional research and investigation that I want to do regarding this particular individual. I will say this, that the individual that we're talking about does appear to check all of the boxes. So here's what's important to note here. First of all, yes, REM Crew was working with, sort of specialty metals and things of that nature. And they obviously did patent this particular alloy that we're talking about here. It wasn't disseminated or sold commercially, so it does appear that REM Crew was the only place that would have had this stuff because they were the ones that patented this stuff. Again, it was patented in 1953. The patent ended or expired in 73 or 74, which was after the skyjacking took place. So I talked with this gentleman a little bit about this. He was a senior individual with this particular, with REM Crew Titanium back in those days, and with this particular division. So he knows his stuff. He knows what was going on. What is very interesting is that there was a very small group involved with this. Indeed, in terms of the actual engineers, there are really about 7 or 8 people, according to this guy. Now, additionally, they did have lab techs. And it sounds like there were a handful more lab techs, but basically you're talking in totality about 25 or so people working in this particular area. Now, it is important to note that the lab techs did not wear ties. I asked about this, and it's important to note that the lab engineers did wear ties. I asked about this because obviously D.B. Cooper was wearing a tie and managed to pick up this stuff on his clip-on tie. So part of what I also found out is that these engineers, this guy in particular, as well as a couple of people that he worked with, would indeed actually travel to their clients occasionally, specifically Boeing, Northrop Grumman, and some other companies. So the way he explained it to me is that, yeah, they would actually travel up to Seattle to Boeing firstly, because again, they do business with Boeing. Not only on the commercial side of things, but also on the military side of things. And he said, yeah, they spent actually quite a bit of time on the assembly floor around the airplanes discussing components and parts and so forth that are actually being designed or designed into these Boeing aircraft, and talking about the specific materials and things that obviously REM Crew Titanium created and that made its way into airplanes and so forth. So this is exactly what I this is exactly what I expected. This is exactly what I was thinking took place. I've said that I don't believe D.B. Cooper actually worked at Boeing, but I felt like there was some sort of relationship with a subcontractor or something of that nature. And I've speculated that D.B. Cooper was a guy who probably had traveled to Seattle, had been at Boeing several times, so he was familiar with Boeing, familiar with the 727, familiar with the Seattle region, but wasn't somebody who actually lived and worked there permanently. And this fits perfectly based upon what this gentleman said in terms of the rounds that they would make. He and a couple other guys in particular visiting these subcontractors for REM Crew Titanium. So I think that's critically important, and it checks one of the boxes as far as I'm concerned. The other thing that's interesting to consider relates to just the nature of the economy at the company there. So specifically, I asked them, did the company experience layoffs? Did his particular division experience layoffs, people getting fired, things of that nature? Because D.B. Cooper skyjacked the jet for a reason. I'm having a hard time believing that the guy was perfectly set, perfectly comfortable, and decided one day, you know what, I'm going to rip off $200,000, jump out of a jet. So I figured something had to trigger that. And indeed, there was sort of, kind of these boom and bust cycles that would take place at this particular company as well as other companies that would lead to people being laid off and then ultimately hired back up when things improved. And not only did they experience something like this in the early 60s, I think around 1960, but also in 1971 specifically. So it does appear to me that D.B. Cooper was one of these guys who fell victim to this sort of downturn in the aerospace sector and this specialty metals sector, but it also does seem likely that he may have been hired back at some point, maybe 6 or so months later, which makes perfect sense to me as well. Reason being because, as many of you know, I am absolutely convinced that D.B. Cooper buried the money that was found on Tena Bar, in part because he initially intended on jumping near Seattle and he got delayed and ended up jumping closer to Portland, Oregon, and needed to do something with the money temporarily. Couldn't walk into town, lugging a 22-pound bag of cash and everything else. So, but as Tom Case showed, and some of the scientific evidence that was later determined regarding the money that was found, and specifically these organisms called diatoms that were found on the money, that clearly shows that this money was actually submerged in the Columbia River in the springtime, and it does, as a matter of fact, happen to correlate precisely with a couple of flooding events that took place in the Columbia River, one in June of 72 and one in June of 74. So I've speculated, I've theorized that D.B. Cooper came from back east, flew back east after the skyjacking, left the money buried on Tena Bar for a period of time, laid low, but that he eventually realized that there was some historic flooding taking place on the Columbia River in June of 72, and therefore he realized that he needed to go and collect that money. Otherwise, there may not be any money, may get swept out to sea, maybe uncovered, something of that nature. And that he made his way back in June of 72, recovered the money, those 3 packets that were later found by Brian Ingram on the beach, notwithstanding. But one of the really big mysteries with this case here is, what happened with the money that he collected, the $194,000 that he apparently got away with that's never been found. Apparently, it never re-entered circulation, or it seems unlikely that it re-entered circulation. And I've theorized that perhaps something changed in D.B. Cooper's life between the time of the skyjacking and between that and the time that the money would have been recovered. Again, June of 72, so 7 months later. That is entirely consistent with what I've described here, which is somebody actually working at Remcrew Titanium, which, again, was later bought out by a couple other companies, the name changed and so forth, but losing their position, getting laid off, being in sort of a desperate situation, not really knowing what the future holds. But lo and behold, 6-7 months later, things indeed do change. The guy gets his position back at the company, and I guess all's well that ends well. And perhaps, given a situation like that, this person, D.B. Cooper, felt like there was really no need to run the risk of spending the money. It's one of the few sort of scenarios that I can come up with that explains all of this stuff. So that's kind of what is going on as far as this case is concerned right now. It does appear that we have identified the specific department where D.B. Cooper came from. And again, we're dealing with a very small universe of people. And quite excitedly, there is one person that does appear to check the boxes. This person is no longer alive. I'm looking into him right now, and I will obviously update you as new information becomes available. Okay, folks, that's kind of where we are today. I think that's pretty exciting. We may actually have D.B. Cooper in our sights at this point. So that's pretty thrilling news. And of course, the other cool thing about this is based on science. This is based on science, people. And so that makes it much more exciting. And it's one thing that I've said many times before, that on measure, time is sort of a double-edged sword in this case. Of course, things change, memories fade, people die, things of that nature happen. But there are advances in science and technology that have come along as well that they didn't have back in 1971. And I am firmly of the opinion that in the long run, science is going to win out on this. I think we will figure out who this guy is. Indeed, we may actually know who this guy is right now. Okay, there we go. Again, as usual, if you have any comments or questions, feel free to shoot me an email. That's eric@ericulis.com. And until next time, folks, as always, cheers.